Howdy. This is Written by the Rest, the podcast that makes you ask the big questions like, am I a good person for giving a fledgling podcast my precious, precious time? And the answer is yes, you are. You're awesome. Thank you. I'm here as always with my co-host and friend and guest and confidant, Sam Nicholson. Sam, you know about stuff.
I do. Yeah.
What do you know about the British Indian overseas territories other than the fact that it's a bit of a mouthful?
It's a bit of a mouthful. I don't know a lot. I'm guessing we probably haven't been overly kind to them over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Because we weren't kind to anybody, were we? Ever, really.
No, that's pretty much colonialism for you.
Yeah.
We're going to cover off the Chagos Islands today.
Wonderful.
Just as a quick heads up to any listeners, we are both drinking because this is a Saturday when we're recording this. We're not drunk. We're definitely...
So we're tipsy.
Borderline tipsy.
Yeah.
But no, we've still got our faculties together. Don't drink in podcast, kids. So let's move on. So the Chagos Archipelago is a big group of islands and atolls about 500 miles away from the Maldives, pretty much slap bang in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Sounds nice, right? Yeah.
Tropical.
Well, you're wrong, Sam.
Oh, okay.
Why don't you get this format yet? Obviously, that doesn't sound nice, you idiot.
It's like QI.
Yeah, right? We need an alert. If this was all cuddly and fuzzy, this would be called Written by the Colonialists. So here we are, the cold hard truth bitches.
Maybe that could be your sister podcast.
Yeah, where I just lie. Did you know, Sam, that we, the British,
The royal we,
the royal we,
yeah.
not us
not me and you.
personally,
Yeah.
removed a native population off of an island about 50 years ago because we're good friends with the Americans and they wanted to use some of our stuff. But they didn't want other people using it at the same time, and that's pretty much what happened to the Chagosian people.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I think we've done it a few times, haven't we? Let's be honest.
Yeah. This one's very recent, though, and I'm going to touch on this... 70s?
70s.
Or 60s.
Yeah.
60s and 70s.
Because I might be thinking of a different country, but I'm fairly sure. In London, there's effectively a national football team of the Chagos Islands.
Yeah.
And although they aren't recognised by FIFA or independently, they do play tournaments against other unrecognised nations, and it's quite nice.
I did not know that. That's very interesting. Well, that's cool. I like to learn these new things. I haven't got that in the script.
Little segue. There you go.
A little segue. So let's start how most stories do, at the beginning. We'll do this a lot, by the way, if you're new. We start at the beginning and then get to the end.
Tends to be how stories work.
It is, yes. Unless you want to be smart and do that thing where it's like 3 weeks earlier.
Yeah, flashbacks.
Or 3 weeks forward. You know,
we should do flashbacks.
Yeah, we're not doing that.
No, okay.
So the Chagos Islands were originally uninhabited, so not a lot of information to fill in there. It's likely that the atolls and the low reefs were used by traders and fishermen many, many hundreds of years ago, but from the looks of it, nothing of interest really happened until Europeans turned up in the 16th century, which is basically always the case, right? You know, no beer, no TV.
It's a very white-centric view of the world, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're having that one today.
Something probably did happen before we got there. We just don't know about it.
Yeah. I don't think they exactly left much behind.
No.
So, in the 16th century, if you hadn't guessed it already, it was discovered by Europeans. And it was the Portuguese. No surprise there. Portuguese pretty much discovered lots of stuff around this sort of time. And they discovered the islands around 1555. And it was this point in the islands start to take on about 400 different types of names, which I'm not going to go into the detail of because, honestly, it was like half a page in a book.
Can you do 3?
No.
No.
They basically
2?
named... No. I didn't remember them.
Just the one.
This isn't in the script.
Just Chagos.
Just Chagos.
Just the colonial name for it.
Yes, that's pretty much it. Well, the Portuguese name for it. Or Spanish. That's Portuguese.
Yeah, different languages.
Yeah. So I'm not going to go into all of that. Anyway, the Portuguese were busy doing slavery in Brazil at the time, so it remained uninhabited. Interesting. Do you know how many how many Brazilians that the Portuguese actually enslaved?
I wouldn't like to put a number on it, no.
I'm not sure, but I'm pretty certain it was in the Brazilians.
Because I've had a couple of beers, that was much funnier.
Yeah, I know, that's why I said it. So instead, the French claimed it in 1665. And by the 1770s, they were dishing out permits to let businesses establish coconut plantations, or copra, which is basically just coconut oil. And they were actually, that was another name for them. They were known as the Oil Islands at one point because they produced lots of coconut oil.
Interesting.
Now, obviously, at this sort of time, in a faraway tropical land, who you're going to call if you need lots of backbreaking labour to be done?
It's not white people, is it? Let's be honest.
No, it's slaves. That's right. Bang on. It wasn't Brazilians. So the French brought in slaves. It's a little colonial hack. You got some hard labour being done.
Yeah.
In up to 200
Gotta make some
years
money,
ago.
haven't you?
You got to make money somehow.
Yeah. Got to exploit people.
Got to exploit people for free, or at a very low cost. I don't know what the slave trade was like back then, but
Yeah.
yeah, they brought on slaves essentially to work these islands, and yeah, pretty cool.
Pretty shit.
Anywho, the first slave colony was founded about the end of the 18th century, so it was 1793 to be exact. It was mostly West Africans, but we see a mix of other peoples being thrown in. I think there's mention of Mauritius and the Seychelles. I can't pronounce Seychelles. Seashells by the Seychelles. There you go. But yeah, they brought in slaves from all over, but it was mostly West Africans at the time. Now, just to put this in context, at this point we'll have had over 200 years of the islands being populated. So,
Really? Wow.
If it was up to the modern day, it would have been 200 years.
Yeah.
So I just want to establish this, make a point, because I'm going to return to this later in the episode. So they were actually slaves until about 1840, when, as you know, most people were made free, or most slaves were made free. Pretty much everyone descended from the original slaves. During all this, the British took the islands. Woo!
As we do.
Yeah, go Britain. We won it, kicking the shit out of Napoleon.
Obviously.
And was given the island as a part of the 1814 Treaty of Paris.
Sorry, I love the thought of the surrender, and then we're going, we want more. And they just go, Chagos?
Do you like coconut? What's coconut?
Fucking love it.
Love it. Bring it. Yeah. How many islands you got? What? Yeah. Bring on the oil. Yeah. So we got loads of stuff. One of them was probably the steak bake as well that we got from the French.
Yeah?
Yeah, probably.
Sausage roll?
But we also got Mauritius in the deal. Maybe the sausage roll. We didn't get the croissant. They got to keep that.
Wow. Shit.
I know. So getting up to the modern day, or in this case, 1965. So 1965. That's how far away this was. It's
quite modern.
This was our parents' lifetime.
Yeah. Just to be fair.
Yeah. 1965, though, we now have an established free population on the island. They've been there for, like I say, about 200 years now.
How long have they been free for, roughly?
So since about 1840, so probably 120 odd years.
So they've not had a particularly fair shake of it, have they, really?
No. I mean, let's face it, these people would have been more than free to do whatever they wanted, but also you've got to consider that they've been indoctrinated to do one thing. That's all they're good at.
Farm coconuts.
Farm coconut. I mean, you're not going to get that kind of work in Slough, you know?
There isn't many coconut trees popping up in Slough.
Very few. Torquay, maybe.
Torquay.
But not
Slough.
Perth. In Australia?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. So yeah, so they've been free for about 200 years. They don't really have any discernible skills. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to diminish the Chagosian people.
Don't diminish coconut farming. There's
also
lots of skills.
diminish coconut farm. Yeah.
When I was in Barbados, I saw a guy climb a tree with nothing but a machete and chop coconuts down. It was extremely skilled.
Okay.
Admittedly, it's a very finite set of skills.
It's a niche set of skills.
But it is a skill.
No, they had like carpenters and stuff, and people who could do like handy trades. I'm not diminishing that, but you wouldn't have people who are like accountants.
No,
there
isn't an IT support department in Chagos.
No, especially not in 1965. So, yeah, there were literally generations of people who were born, lived and worked on this island. They died on this island, and everyone kind of pulled together to do their job. Even people who were what you would consider as retired still did light duties. Everyone had to do something. Children were educated, I think, up to about the age of 12 or 14, and then they basically went straight to work. They didn't have a standard education either at the time.
Which, to be fair, wasn't too dissimilar to the UK in that time, really. Or anywhere.
No, I suppose not. I suppose a lot of people finished.
You became a teenager, and I mean, my mum, even in the 70s, got to 15 and left school and went to work.
Well, maybe there isn't that much of a jump then. I definitely knew it was early teens, late tweens. Yeah, essentially the Chagos Islands were quite a kind of isolated, I suppose,
Yeah.
in what they did.
Yeah.
They had very unique skill sets that were very unique to those particular people in that particular area, which is reasonable. Now, to avoid some confusion, mostly for me other than anyone else, Mauritius gained independence from the British in March 1968. But before that, in 1965, ahead of this independence, the British formed the British Indian Ocean Territory and essentially split the Chagos Archipelago from Mauritius. Everyone's still in the room.
Yeah.
So they basically went, right, Mauritius, you can go do your own thing. However, we're just going to take this stuff. No particular reason. This is just going to be ours, though, now.
So they were like, you can have independence, but that bit's still ours.
Yeah, pretty much.
Effectively.
Like we're keeping this stuff. You got no use for it. It's just coconuts. They paid Mauritius for this. They paid Mauritius about £3 million, and the companies that operated them, they bought those as well for a further £600,000, £650,000 at the time.
Quite a lot of cash.
Not a bad deal for 60 odd years ago. So the big question here is, why on earth is Britain showing so much interest in a bunch of islands which, in the nicest way possible, are pretty useless? There's not a lot of land, you can't farm it, you have got the copra and the oil, but, I mean, come on.
I mean, we have form, don't we?
Yeah.
Islands. I mean, I think we just wanted holiday destinations, to be honest.
You reckon?
Like,
You think they were going to set up
Why
Butlins
did we
up there?
keep Barbados for so long? Like, what
True.
was the strategic point of that?
True.
Like, just give people their fucking freedom.
Just give them the land. Just let them
Exactly.
let them
do what they want.
Stop making them a part of a Commonwealth.
And then-
They don't
yeah.
stop making the Commonwealth trying to happen.
Exactly.
It's
And
not going to
then
happen.
stop kicking off when they say we want our freedom.
Yeah, or reparations.
Yeah.
Ugh. Anyway, British.
Sorry.
Well, without teaching most of you who are listening to suck eggs, the 60s was, pretty much the height of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened in 1962. US joined the Vietnam War in 1965, and there was a huge build-up of nuclear weapons on pretty much every side. That's pretty much a 15-second sum-up for you. America good, Russia bad. Mm-hmm. So, the islands were seen as a strategic outpost, a place where ships could be refueled, an airstrip could be built to accommodate aircraft, a great location to deal with Russia if the Cold War had ever turned hot, and to torture people where nobody could see it. Oh, sorry, I'll explain that last bit later. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, not a shock.
No. So the US approached Britain and said, hey, look, we want to put an airfield up somewhere in the middle of the ocean. Can you help me out?
And we were like, well,
Hang on a minute. Have I got a deal for you? Guess what we've just bought?
we got this lovely little island full of coconut trees.
Anyone on it? Nope.
Not anymore.
Nope. Not anymore. So yeah, that was one of the deals. Britain came along and said, yeah, we've got these set of islands. America went, cracking. They probably didn't say cracking. They went,
Brilliant.
damn good, thank you. They went, thank you. Yeah, we'll take it. However, we want to make sure no one's on the island. We want it uninhabited for obvious reasons. And the British just agreed to that. They went, yeah, there's no one on it. So in return for this, Britain gets a hefty discount on something called the American Polaris submarine program, which I have no doubt is something to do with nuclear weapons, and I imagine submarines. But we have a problem here. The main island that they wanted to use was one called Diego Garcia. There's loads and loads of islands, but Diego Garcia is the main one here that we're talking about.
That sounds like a Spanish Broadway star.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Starring Diego Garcia.
Yeah, I like
it does, doesn't it? Which at the time has a population of about 1,800 to 2,000. I'll be perfectly honest, it's been hard to verify exact numbers because the British like to confirm there was less and the actual Chagosians like to confirm that there was more.
Yeah.
It's
a lot of people, either way.
There's a lot of people. Yeah. There was a few thousand.
Yeah.
Native people, Sam, who lived on this island.
Literally born there.
Born there, bred there, die there. Native people.
Yeah.
Keep hitting this on home because the British have a very different attitude towards this.
Now, I'm going to say right now, for the record, you might want to cut this from the podcast.
Okay.
But how is somebody considered native? Because obviously nobody was native to the Chagos Islands. Mm-hmm. So it's more of a theoretical question. How long does it take for somebody to become native to a place? Is it because you're born there, or is it because you've got lineage there?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a discussion that actually happens in the course, and again, I'll touch on a little bit later. But from my point of view, if that country is all you've known, if that country is all your parents have known, that
Yeah.
country is all your grandparents have known,
Then
and
you are
great-grandparents,
native to that
I would
country,
consider
yeah.
you a native person to that,
Yeah.
that area, that island, that country.
It's just an interesting point, isn't it?
Well, Americans have a very interesting setup where if I was born in New York City, spent 15 minutes there before getting on a plane to the UK, I would have US citizenship. Simple
Yeah.
as that. I would be a US
Yeah.
citizen as far as
Yeah.
I'm concerned. They're concerned.
A bit different, but my wife was born in Sussex.
Yeah.
So she is from Sussex,
Yeah,
technically.
arguably, yeah.
Yeah, it's a strange paradox, isn't it?
Yeah, there's definitions that need to be considered here.
Yeah.
So let's jump ahead a little bit. We're getting to 1966. The British bought up all the copra, as I mentioned earlier. That's dried coconut oil extract plantations, and they closed them. So they pretty much went to the native people and said, "Look, we're done. You've got no more work." And this is really the beginning of the forced deportation. No work means they need to go somewhere else, right? They can't earn money. They got paid a wage, obviously, but if they can't earn that wage anymore, they can't buy things, they can't leave the island, they're kind of isolated, so that's their only choice. Obviously, they were offered to be removed from the island for free. They had boats that they ran. Well, no, oddly enough, people who spent pretty much their entire lives somewhere and don't want to leave so readily, they decided to stay. And over the following 5 years, they continue to ramp up the ways in which they get the people off the island sooner rather than later. As you can imagine, the Americans are getting pretty antsy to get started on what they're building.
They want their airbase, don't they?
They want their airbase. They do actually start delivering kind of supplies and American equipment to the island before even all the Chagosians have left. They don't mess around. They don't fully start building things until later.
Yeah.
So one thing they began to do was I'd say compared to a few of the things I'm going to touch on here, this is quite soft. If you left the island to go to, say, Mauritius or the Seychelles, hey, I got it right. There'd be plenty of reasons. You might be having a baby and they didn't have the medical supplies or the kind of infrastructure for you to have a child on the island.
You know what? I didn't realise the Seychelles was so built up to be more appropriate than the Chagos Islands, to be honest.
They're bigger and they'll have
Oh,
hospitals.
I know they're bigger, but
Yeah.
I mean, I think of the Seychelles as more of a sort of nature reserve these days.
No, they definitely have like
maybe it was different.
towns and
Yeah,
cities and
maybe
stuff.
it's just my interpretation of it.
But essentially, yeah, they had hospitals,
Yeah.
which was a step up from what Chagos
I'm
has.
sure Mauritius certainly did.
Yeah, Mauritius did as well. A lot of people would go to one or the other. It
Yeah.
depended on lots of things, but yeah. So especially if you had a medical emergency as well. So if you needed an operation, you needed appendix removing, you couldn't do that on the island. You had to go out. So anything like that happened, they would obviously get a ticket, go to the island, do what they needed to do, come back. Now, what was happening in the early days was you would have your baby, go back to the ticket office. Hey there, Mr. or Mrs. Ticket person, are ready to go back to the island? They'd go, no, it's a one-way ticket you've bought. They haven't bought a one-way ticket. They just aren't being allowed to come back to the island.
Yeah.
So you think about it, the father's back on the island, working away, or in fact, probably not working away at this moment, frightened of his
Frightened of death.
wife and child. Yeah, not allowed back. Yeah. They're stranded now in Mauritius or in the Seychelles. So the same thing happened for slightly less urgent affairs. So again, if the Chagosians wanted to go on holiday, they wanted to visit family, or hell, they wanted to buy a new shirt.
Yeah.
You would go abroad. You would go to Mauritius, or you go to Seychelles, and the same thing would happen. You would go back. You'd try and catch your boat back home. Mm-hmm. No, sorry, your ticket is not valid anymore. And this was all a surprise. None of this, they weren't warned about this. It was just, you would literally, it's like you going to, South Africa for a holiday, going to your return ticket and saying, sorry, this is your home now. You live in South Africa.
All right.
All right, fair enough.
Could be worse.
It does get worse. By the time we get to the late 60s, Britain is really starting to strangle the island. They begin stopping all imports of food and medical supplies, and they're also restricting them accessing their own food. So the island had ways in which you could buy rice and you could buy basic medical supplies, you could buy certain things that you need for everyday life. But when they stopped supplying these stores, the Chagosians could still hunt, so they could go fishing, they could find anything that was native, they could eat coconuts,
probably
obviously.
Quite a fertile area.
Yeah, like they had stuff that they could do, but the British administration stopped them doing that as well. They would make up excuses like, these waters are now restricted, you can't use these coconut trees because they're ours. Like, they were doing anything to essentially starve people out of the island.
Wow.
Oh, it gets worse, by the way.
All because we promised America they could have an airbase on this island.
Yes.
Okay.
Keep that in mind as I go into my next point.
Yeah.
A chap called Sir Bruce Greatbatch, he was a person who oversaw the island. He was, I think he was a governor. He oversaw Mauritius. He was a governor who was put in charge of getting people off this island, basically. He's a real piece of shit, and that's why I wanted to mention him, because there isn't actually much information on old Brucey boy. So he was a real piece of shit, and he was responsible for, and I quote, sanitizing the island. And he came up with a final solution level idea to force the islanders out.
Don't say final solution.
No, trust me, I'm not too out of line with using this term. A little bit, maybe. So brace yourself. Just worth noting, nobody ever uses the word sanitize in a good way when it comes to human beings. It's worth using is when you've had a night on the lash and you're talking about your toilet.
Or if you were walking into Sainsbury's 18 months ago.
Yes, or that. That's reasonable. COVID. As a final push in the wrong direction, hold on to your hat, using exhaust fumes from American vehicles that had arrived on the island, they gathered all the dogs, cats and pets and gassed them to death in front of their owners. This is adults, children. They'd gathered all the animals and killed them in front of their owners. Yeah.
Wow.
They brought the children who own dogs and they gassed them to death.
Why?
Because Sir Bruce Greatbatch is clearly a piece of shit. Now, I think I should add for a legal reason here, the British have always declined all responsibility for this.
Well, I'm sure we have, but it still probably fucking happened.
Oh, I'm almost certain it happened. It's awful.
Why
would they lie?
What is the best possible outcome? What is it? You killed my dog? Yeah, let's go.
What annoys me most about this whole situation, killing animals aside, or kids' pets aside, is that the Chagosians always made a point of wanting to work with this situation. The Chagosians always said, we will work for you, we'll clean your toilets, we will tend your gardens, we'll be housekeepers, we'll do anything to stay here. It's not like they said, oh, right, okay, well, we haven't got a job now, we'll just sit around and do nothing. They wanted to work for their keep. They wanted to stay where they wanted to stay and just live their lives. And they wouldn't allow them to do it.
It's the fact they're even in that situation in the first place that is even more difficult to stomach, because they shouldn't have been made to feel that way.
Well, a lot of this all happened under their nose. They were having inspectors coming through.
No, that's what I mean. The fact they're on this island is one thing. It's not their fault. They were put there by people.
Yeah. And they were slaves.
Yeah, and they spent a couple of generations there making a life for themselves, doing X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And the fact that the land has then been sold under them and they've been forced to move again just makes it even worse.
And this happened 60 years ago.
It's fucking terrible.
My mother was alive. Your mother was probably alive when this happened. This isn't something that was, it's 500 years ago.
It's really recent history.
Yeah, it's unforgivable.
It's sickening.
Eventually, the island was cleared entirely of the natives by about 1973. And I'd love to end the story there and say that they got relocated in Mauritius and the I can't say it again. Seychelles. And they all lived happily ever after. But this podcast is pretty fucking bleak, so we carry on. The majority of the Chagos people were either relocated, as I mentioned, to either Mauritius or the Seychelles. Depending on where you were, you either ended up on the streets or, in some cases, at the beginning, they were put in prison cells. Now, they weren't under arrest, they didn't lose their freedom, but that's the only place they could put the people that had come to the island. They didn't have anywhere to put them. They didn't have spare housing. They did have some housing that was for fishermen, but that was only temporary. But the rest were moved to prisons.
Was that in Mauritius?
Yep. Mauritius is what I'm focused on mostly, because that's where a lot of the people ended up going. So, despite Mauritius happily taking money in the first place, they were never fully on board with this from the beginning anyway. And unfortunately, the Chagos people were slap bang in the middle of taking the outcomes of these poor decisions on both sides. They didn't have jobs to go to. They didn't have homes to move into. And the later arrivals were pretty much forced onto a boat with one suitcase. The journey to Mauritius was no better either. Hundreds were cramped onto ships designed to carry only dozens. A bit of a timely reminder, as we were discussing earlier, of how their ancestors potentially got to the island in the first place. The irony isn't lost on how they left it 200 years later. It's disgusting. Again, none of it's fully verified. This is what I got from reading some of the accounts from the Chagosian people, is that people died on the journey. This wasn't like I say, an old wooden ship from 300 years ago. This was a perfectly serviceable boat that was used to transport goods to the island, people to the island. Many families, talking mostly about the Mauritius were moved to the outskirts of the city, where they would build shanty towns and survive picking up whatever low menial paid work that they could find. Eventually, though, some of the Chagosian women were turning to prostitution just to make ends meet. Now, the Chagos people typically had low-skilled jobs, and they certainly didn't have qualifications to back them up if they did. So I mentioned, like I say, there were probably plenty of people who could do carpentry, could do joinery, could do all these kind of skilled work, but because racists being racists as well, they weren't welcomed into the society in the first place.
Yeah, and it wasn't a formally recognised qualification, was it? It was just...
No, they were just good at doing that thing.
They had been doing this thing for a long time.
And there were already people in Mauritius who could do these jobs, so they would hire people from Mauritius. They wouldn't hire, in the nicest way possible, people who've just come out of nowhere and started taking up room in the nicest way possible. That's kind of how they saw it.
Yeah.
Kids weren't attending school, so they weren't educated enough to really seek help or gain any understanding of how to get out of this situation. So it's a vicious circle. So no considerations were taken here. They were beyond abandoned by the British and swept under the rug, and the Mauritian government was there to sort it out, and they weren't really invested in wanting to do it, despite being paid money. Speaking of money, the Chagosian people were compensated, and they were given compensation, but it was meagre to say the least. There was a sum given to Mauritius to dish out, as it were, and distribute to the Chagosian people of a sum of about £650,000. But they never did. They ended up holding on to these funds, interest-free I might stress, between 1972 until 1977. And when they eventually did get it 5 years later, only 200 of the workers were eligible due to being, and I'm quoting here, temporary workers.
Wow.
Temporary being 200 years. So they do go on to get further compensation. They get another round in 1982, which works out to around £1,000 per adult and less than £30 per child. And again, it happens, I think, a few years later, but it works out at about £180 per person. Due to the economic position the Chagosian people were left in, crime levels rose, and they would end up getting a bad reputation to boot. Along with racial profiling, it's a classic catch-22. This is basically what happened to black people in America in the 50s and 60s.
Well, I mean, it's sort of similar to the Windrush generation, isn't it?
Yeah.
In a sense.
Yeah. Please expand.
Well, just in terms of poor treatment, bad compensation.
Yeah. They were taken advantage of, and when they weren't needed anymore, they were thrown aside.
Elsewhere.
Or sent home. Yeah. Windrush was people. They tried to send their people home.
Sent home, I guess, but it wasn't their home, was it?
No.
It's a similar thing here.
Yeah, it's pretty disgusting. Like I say, the racial profiling came from the fact that because they had no opportunity and no jobs and no chance to improve themselves and prove their lot, they had to turn to crime. What else are you going to do? It's the classic stealing bread to feed your starving family. That's the situation they were in.
It's the racism paradox, isn't it?
Yeah. So as the years went on, there were several legal challenges on the ownership of the island. Britain's excuse was pretty much, yeah, but you were temporary workers though, weren't you? And it was pushed back on each and every opportunity. Britain eventually gave Chagosian people British citizenship under the British Overseas Territory Act of 2002. So some of the islanders actually did decide to move to England. I mean, what are they going to lose? They're not exactly doing well in Mauritius. They've been given I'd like to say a golden ticket. They're given a ticket to have a second chance at starting a life in Britain.
Yeah, you'd take it, wouldn't you?
You would, yeah. And now, there's more to this story, but interestingly, most of the Chagosian Islands ended up in Crawley. So they landed in the UK, and there are a lot of other things that happened, but they ended up in Crawley. Now, for the Americans and non-Brits that are listening here, Crawley is about an hour's south of London, and of all the crimes that Britain have done in this episode, this is probably one of the worst that they could have done, because moving from a tropical island and then moving them to Crawley is unforgivable.
I've just this is the football thing I was talking about as well. I've just realised.
Yeah, are they based in Crawley?
Yeah.
A lot of people settled in Crawley.
Yeah, I was getting confused. I mean, at least it isn't Slough.
True. Yeah, it could have been worse. In 2009, Britain tried to make the British Indian Overseas Territories a marine preserve, which sounds lovely, doesn't it? Doesn't that sound nice?
Sounds like a place for fish and whales and sharks and...
Not people. Yeah, you're right.
No.
They were doing everything they could to protect turtles and birds, it seems, but it was really just a crappy smokescreen.
Yeah.
They'd have to stay uninhabited on basically a permanent resident basis.
Yeah.
So
otherwise it can't be a preserve, surely.
Correct. Interestingly enough, this came out of a WikiLeaks document. Do you remember WikiLeaks?
Julian Assange. What a
right?
ledge.
What a blast from the past.
What a stand-up guy.
Well, this came out of WikiLeaks.
Wow.
There you go. I really should look at them at some point.
Isn't he still in
Russia.
Is it Russia now?
Yeah, he's a Russian citizen now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Like Steven Seagal, he's a
Russian
friend
citizen.
of Putin now, isn't he?
Steven Seagal, we need to do an episode. I think I've mentioned that a few
do,
times now.
yeah.
We definitely need to do an episode. Outside of the British legal system, though, they've pretty much lost all of the appeals in court. So anything that's gone out of a British court, so I think at one point it actually went to the World Court. It went to the World Court in 2019, and they lost. They were told that what they did was unlawful, and Britain just went, ah, la 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 la. I'm not listening.
The World Court sounds made up, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It sounds like something that's in a Steven Seagal film.
It does, yeah.
Oddly enough.
Yeah.
This is still something that's ongoing, obviously. The Chagosian people are still fighting every day for their home, their island.
Yeah, and for reparation at the very least.
And this is still an ongoing thing. Like, this is still mentioned in the media. In fact, at the time I wrote this, I didn't write this today, I wrote this about a week or so ago, there was an article where the kind of negotiations were being opened up with James Cleverly, who is the Secretary of State of Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs for the United Kingdom, said, and I'm paraphrasing just a little bit here, they have no intention of returning the islands to their people. So
to paraphrase further, he said, fuck off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So over half a century later, these temp workers are really playing the long game, I think it's safe to say as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting discussion point there, isn't there? When does temporary become permanent?
Again, I think
How long does it take?
When your great-grandparents are brought over in a boat against their will, I think that island becomes yours.
Well, apparently not.
Shoot me.
Apparently not.
But yeah. Ultimately, all Britain has to do is wait out the Chagosians to essentially die out. Like, the last generation of the Chagosian people who actually lived on the island are probably, in their maybe 70s, 80s now? If not older.
Yeah.
Because after all, the newer generations have never set foot in their home. There were some efforts to get people or allow some of the people to visit the island one last time, as it were. They were kind of given like a day pass. But they made a point very clear that if you ever try and go back on the island again, you're not allowed there, etc., etc. So originally the agreement between the US and Britain was for the island to be leased. So they weren't given the island. They were leased the island until 2016. Unfortunately, though, an extension for the base was made in 2016, adding an additional 30-odd years to the lease, letting Americans build Guantanamo Bay version 2.0. Apparently this is used as a black site for the CIA for torture interrogation. But you didn't hear that from me, Sam.
Was that Julian Assange again?
I've got nothing in here about it, but who knows. So, yeah, that's kind of where we're going to finish up. Any final thoughts, Sam?
I mean, it's just one more chapter to a terrible book of British history, isn't it?
Yeah. The most disgusting thing for me about this, and don't get me wrong, no matter what time this would have happened in our history, this would have been bad. But the fact that this happened in our parents' lifetimes, this happened 60 years ago.
It's terrible and it's really recent.
Really recent.
And we've definitely done worse as a nation over the years, but I'm not sure we've done worse as recently.
We have. I don't think we've gassed kids' pets to death.
It's been a while,
recently.
hasn't it?
It's been a while. It's probably been 60 or 70 years. But yeah, it's there's a lot. Also, it's worth noting there's a lot more to read about this. We've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
If you want to learn more, there are a bunch of resources out there. I referenced a graphic novel, actually, of all things. I always tend to buy a book. I referenced a graphic novel, The Chagos Betrayal: How the British Robbed an Island and Made Its People Disappear. It's by a lady called Florine Grosset. Like I say, it's a graphic novel. It's heart-wrenching. It's fantastic. It's beautifully put together, and I'd advise anyone to read it. I've included a link at the bottom if you want to buy your own copy.
Is she Chagosian? Just out of interest?
I don't think she is. I think she's from Mauritius originally, but she's worked with the Chagos people quite a lot. So yeah, next episode. What are you thinking?
Could we do an exploration of the history of the Easter Bunny? Or Santa Claus?
No.
Okay.
I'm going to be honest with you. I was thinking a biography of Henry Ford and how he helped inspire literal Nazis.
Why
but
not?
maybe the one after.
Yeah? Something a bit happier?
Yeah. No, that's not what this is about.
Okay.
I mean, when you have to mention inspiring Nazis, that's going to be a good episode.
Yeah, I mean, it's no better than gassing pets, is it?
No,
to be honest.
we don't talk about gassing pets in that episode. We don't talk about gassing full stop. I mean, we could, but we're not.
Yeah.
Pluggables.
Pluggables.
Plug away.
Check out my YouTube channel at Sammy Shares TV. We're talking about TV, obviously, movies, and science recently as well.
Yes, I saw.
Particularly prehistory or human prehistory.
I believe that's history before humans arrived. Is that correct? I'm no expert.
Well, to be fair, that is the general term, but obviously there were hominids around at the time. It's what you consider modern human, which is the
Or people who shop at Iceland.
tricky question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because Iceland wasn't there.
I'm talking about the shop.
Oh, right. The shop definitely wasn't there.
I'm kidding. I'm not that classist. Again, American listeners are going to be like, what the hell's Iceland?
Yeah, what's Iceland?
What's the country got to do with this?
The country was there. It was just covered in more ice than it is now.
Yeah. So, subscribe, like, make a suggestion for a future podcast, comment, do whatever you want.
Something happy, future podcast.
No happy podcast. This isn't happiness. Okay. I'm spreading
this is sadness.
Despair and sadness. That is this podcast. Take care, everybody, and I'll see you next time.